What do Glitch Production and Spindle Horse have in common? And no, not their incomprehensible amount of Rule 34 online. Well, I'll give you a quick hint.
I love you guys. Don't get me wrong. It's all about this. But for the first time in my life, I can say, F you!
I didn't sell out, son. I bought in. Keep that in mind.
We'll get more into that in just a second. Indie has always been a thing. Wanted to watch a film that major Hollywood productions weren't offering? All you had to do was look to the indie scene and find something that filled that need. These days, just hop onto YouTube and you'll find plenty of indie creators whose output is just as good, if not better, than what Hollywood is producing. Miss the early sci-fi horror vibes of Alien? Well, Alien Mondays has you covered. Feel like animated horror barely exists anymore? And we're absolutely bummed by the execution and nosedive in quality that was Adult Swim's Uzumaki? Well, Pleasant Inn exists. Think not enough cartoons pander to your gooner sensibilities? Well, indie animation has that in spades. Unfortunately, indie animation, like all things in life, is susceptible to the same issues that plague mainstream art. And perhaps the biggest issue in indie creators' faces right now is that of selling out. And at what point does a piece of indie animation or a creator stop being considered indie? When does something made entirely outside of Hollywood's megacorporate sphere start becoming just another safe company-owned product? Now, I know I've talked a lot about Vivzie as of late, and don't worry, I'm not done. I'm gonna take a step back for a bit though, of course, since I get that some of you are probably a little burnt out on the topic. That said, she's a major figure when it comes to the conversation around indie animation losing its edge, so she's kind of hard to ignore, but don't worry, as of next week I'll likely start talking about my excitement for the reboot of King of the Hill and common side effects. But Vivziepop used to be the biggest face of indie animation, a self-made creator whose raw, unapologetic art stood out in a sea of corporate polish.
But before that, a word from my sponsor, viewers like you. If it weren't for all you beautiful bastards, I wouldn't be making these. So be sure to throw me a like and leave a comment on what you think of the whole situation below. It greatly helps push my video to the algorithm, and it's a quick couple clicks for you.
Her style was weird, stringy, and reminiscent of the kinds of shows you'd watch as a kid, like Invader Zim and many others. On top of that, the animation was smoother than anything you'd see in those big budget shows. And with a team of scrappy freelance animators, Vivzie cemented her place as the face of indie animation as we knew it. Even if you didn't like her style of writing or character designs, it was damn near impossible to miss her work. But that was then. Today, Vivziepop represents something else entirely. The art of selling out. A swapping soul for reach, of turning a creative dream into another commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, losing much of the quality that the series had in its earlier days. The fluid animation swapped for far easier to do corporate animation styles. Hazbin Hotel was built on an entire indie team. Scrappy voice actors, loyal animators, fans turned collaborators who believed in a shared vision. But as soon as the money came in, most of the people were cut. But not because they weren't good enough, but because Vivzie wanted somebody else, someone famous. Vivziepop replaced her indie team, not just because Amazon demanded it in the first place to a certain degree, but out of her own vanity, chasing clout instead of creative chemistry. And in doing so, she fell into the same trap as one of gaming's most infamous sellouts, Hideo Kojima. Now, I'm not just throwing Kojima's name out there as a means to just throw him under the bus for no reason. Kojima was once a visionary, using whatever he had to create incredibly iconic video games. However, he eventually turned his games into expensive vehicles for his Hollywood obsession of films, hiring actors not because they fit, but because he could. Fan favorite voice actor of Solid Snake, David Hayter, was unceremoniously replaced for Kiefer Sutherland, and this has just become basically his go-to for making games now. It's basically become a meme now where he collects celebrities to take photos with, and photos of some other things. Yeah. He stopped making games for the love of it and started using them as a vehicle to chase cinematic prestige. It's why almost nothing he's produced lately holds a candle to the peak video game experience that was Metal Gear Solid Rising: Revengeance, a game made purely out of love for the medium and memes. Lots of memes. And this was a game that he didn't even have a part in making. Now that minor rant about Kojima is over with, Vivziepop is almost no different, as she started using her shows to fulfill a personal fantasy, casting not the best voices, but her favorite gamers and influencers. Not who the characters need, but who she wants to work with. to give her indie projects a pedigree she sees as superior, which is incredibly unfortunate because the pilot actually did incredibly well, including the goodbye song that includes all the original cast. It's actually bizarre that Smiling Friends, a show that has now become big enough to be parodied by The Simpsons. Side note, Zach Hadel is almost certainly going to be riding that high for a long time, I'm sure. Hell, he even reposted it on his Twitter, so it's clear he's enjoying that moment. But for a show with that level of recognition, it's actually crazy that Zach Hadel and Michael Cusack have always believed in including as many independent artists as possible, oftentimes keeping them as accurate as they are to their YouTube counterparts. Joel Haver being a very good example of this, despite the fact including them in their animations actually causes the show to cost a little bit more. Meanwhile, Amazon and Vivziepop seem more concerned with maintaining a predictable small group of hand-picked animators within their circle. Smiling Friends, while utilizing companies like Bento Box and Princess Pictures for their in-house animation, both studios that have worked on various big-name shows, including Hazbin Hotel, also bring in specialized animators to work on specific scenes. It's not too dissimilar from how when directors in Japan will hand-pick friends of the industry to animate scenes with gorgeous precision. That's why, even though Smiling Friends mostly has a standard Adult Swim aesthetic, it still features little flourishes of absolutely breathtaking animation, since Zach and Michael have gone on record stating it's simply easier to bring their visions to life through talented internet artists rather than relying on their in-house company. These are artists who can painstakingly render each segment with incredible attention to detail, of course, while being compensated fairly. And through this method, not only does the show progress more efficiently, but we also get stunning animation as a result. This is something that Hazbin Hotel used to deliver on until Amazon reduced the number of animators after the pilot. I'm not saying that the whole show had to look like the pilot, but it could have at least included scenes with that same level of fluidity. And with the recent buyout of Hell of a Boss by Amazon, arguably the last bastion of Vivzi's indie scene talent, which still featured some gorgeously rendered moments, who's to say that the next season won't see another drastic drop in quality? And she's unfortunately not alone. I, and many others, often point the finger at her, with good reason, but she merely set a standard for how far indie animators can go when it comes to selling out. As at this point, many of my commentators have even disputed whether or not her shows can be considered indie to begin with. Now the bigger focus has been shifted to Glitch Productions, another indie darling that has gone down a similar path. To what extent? Well, for now that remains to be seen, as this is only a recent development that has just come up out of nowhere. Glitch started out as a company known for over-the-top, low-budget animations. In a now deleted promotional video, much of their early content was just low-budget and essentially machinima memes. But with shows like Murder Drones and The Amazing Digital Circus, they carved out a massive piece of the internet entertainment pie. The same level of hype that Vivziepop enjoyed was now being shared by them. Over time, Glitch began dipping their toes into corporate waters. First came the Netflix acquisition, and more recently, they were bought by the biggest mega corporation on Earth, Amazon. And while they claimed retained 100% creative control, there's no telling how much influence this deal will have on their future productions, since Murder Drones won't be an Amazon exclusive and will still drop on YouTube. Maybe they made a deal with the devil that's perhaps a little less soul-sucking than Vivzi's, as she pretty much sold her entire shows over to Amazon. Still, it sets a worrying precedent for the indie animation sphere. It suggests that in order to survive, indie productions need the backing of a massive corporation. While I'm all for artists getting paid and receiving the financial support they deserve, I don't want to live in a world where it's considered absolutely normal for scrappy indie animators and creators to immediately rely on Big Daddy Bezos bucks. Of course, there are still plenty of indie animators out there creating things outside of Amazon's grasp, but this shift still feels like a warning sign. That said, absolutely go and support those creators if you can. Watch, like, and if you have the means, sub to their Patreons. They absolutely need it more than ever now. So what do you guys think? Is this bad for indie animation, or am I just blowing things out of proportion? Either way, I'll see you next week, guys.